Hi guys, welcome back to the third lecture of the series. Last time we talked about the definitions of Jung's judgment and perception, which when we look at the world of people, that they do match some physical correlations. And then we went over how those judgment and perception signals pair with the introverted and extroverted signals to create this set of four. And that this set of four had a kind of bimodal or multimodal existence as a phenomenon where most people have one of these four quadrants well developed in their physical form. And that discrete reality also seems to have a genetic root to it, as we see in identical twins. But what we didn't do last time is go into the details of what these four signal clusterings actually consist of. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So what you see on screen right now are 20 signals. There's 5 signals for each of those intersections that we talked about. So when you put those two together, there's more nuance that emerges when you intersect those two. Now, why 5? There's nothing special about the number 5 in itself. But what these 5 are the top 5 most consistent and reliable signals, physical signals that we can measure quantitatively, which correlate to that visual cluster that we described and which correlates to the psychology. So the top 5 signals which are most consistent in giving us that reliable correlation between psychology and Vultology were the ones that were selected. So this list has actually gone through a lot of iterative processes, weeding out the signals that don't seem to be robust enough to scale at the level of 10, 50, 100 samples, hundreds of samples. And these are the ones that kind of have triumphed over all that period of time that seem to be dependable signals. Now, the limitation of signals down to 5 is purely instrumental because otherwise it becomes very hard to manage. But it's also because if we keep it to the top 5 most consistent, then we have less probability of an error emerging. Because if we use less reliable signals, then we also have a less reliable metric. So that's very valuable to have. So in any field of study that examines a physical phenomenon, whether that's archaeology, history, or even zoology, biology, you always develop a kind of standardization when it comes to measuring that phenomenon. And that becomes a kind of metric, a ruler. And the same is true for this phenomenon here. Without that, we just have a qualitative, ambiguous realm. So we need to buckle down and actually concretize what the signals are, which describe the signal set that we're looking at or describe the phenomenon we're looking at. And so it's necessary to scaffold a kind of constraint that defines in the best way possible the phenomenon that we're observing. So I like to use this analogy here. There's the measurement tool and then there's the ground truth. Naturally, the ground truth is much more sophisticated and nuanced than the metric, but we nonetheless need a measurement tool. It's just that the measurement tool has to be properly calibrated so that it gets the right result of that ground truth the majority of the time. And that's what we call the Vultology Code. Now, Cognitive Type has the Vultology Code, which can be found at cognitivetype.com/codifier. And that's the one we're going to be going through. And by the way, if you ever come across somebody who claims to have a Vultology practice, but they do not have a code, don't trust that, because you can't get consensus, you can't get standardization, you can't get reliable results, even repeatable for the person themselves without a code. Because it's like if you don't have a ruler and you're trying to measure something 10 times, you're not going to get the same result 10 times if you're just eyeballing it. So any sort of vibe typing that somebody's doing is not reliable. I've been down that road. It's not something that goes anywhere. You won't get off the ground. And most importantly, it escapes scientific quantification if you do that. You can't simply just read somebody's energy and go with that vibe, because everybody has a different vibe they pick up from people. And we need to be very clear. This is why science is so important. We need to be very clear and specific in what vector movements of the body we're talking about. So, and as far as possible, we need to describe things literally in terms of directional movements of limbs, arms, muscle contractions, etc. So that's what the code tries to do. And in some ways it's tyrannical and it's constrictive in that, and it's wrong in a sense to do that. But it's wrong in a necessary way, because if you don't do that, the alternative is we don't make any progress and we don't make any advancements. So it's like one of those necessary evils to constrict an organic ground truth into a measured truth. And that's what we're about to look at today. So we're going to begin with the extroverted judgment signals, or JE signals, which are the proactive and rigid ones. We're just going to breeze through these in a kind of introductory way, but we're actually going to be doing plenty of typing practice together. So you'll have plenty of time to familiarize yourself more with this in a kind of a concrete, hands-on sort of way. So don't worry too much if we're just breezing through, but we need to have a kind of initial mental grasp of what each signal set is before we can proceed with the rest of the model. So here we have the first one is head pushes. So down here at the bottom, you see a kind of short description, which kind of helps you grasp it in a bite-sized way. And this one says that the chin shovels downward in decisive hits. As you can see here with Hillary Clinton and Richard Dawkins, it's not just that it's nodding up and down. It's actually that the head is pushing and almost, like shoveling down into the air, as if it's kind of hunkering down on something or providing a point, pushing a point. And so that yang energy involved with that push is part of the JE signal. And here's the second signal, which is a head shake. Now, what I said about the assertiveness about the first signal also applies to this second one. So it's not just an innocent head shake. There's something about the head shake that also kind of rattles forward as you do it. So you can see a lot of people that they might talk and they do this all the time. They talk and they're asserting with their head shakes. So again, remember how we talked about how the head movements of J are up and down, left to right. Well, this is kind of what I'm talking about here. We'll talk more about Indian culture and head bobbling later. Like these things, some people might bring up the fact that culture has some capacity to add some froth on top of this, and it does add a little froth, in how it manifests. So you have a base truth, and then you have some variation in the culture. But people ask the question: how much can the culture affect the expression of Vultology? And that's an open question. It's not obvious that the culture would be sufficiently strong to override the natural Vultology people have, like identical twins, for example, because as we saw, identical twins raised apart still have the same gestures, even when they're raised in different environments. Therefore, Vultology seems to have a stronger say and it's more grounded, more real than the cultural influence, even the ones that seem to have cultures in which the culture itself adds a little foam on top of the waves of how it expresses itself. It still can be distinguished. But I'll say this, it helps to have the cultural context and as a baseline. So if you want to be really good at Vultology, what you do is you understand where they're coming from, what culture they were raised in, right? And if you have an understanding of what additional elements are added in that culture in terms of their gesticulations, then you control for that, almost like a variable control. You control for that when you're reading them, and then you get an even more excellent result. But that's more high level stuff we'll get into later. Right now we're just trying to go over the signals in a kind of basic way. So the next signal we see here is shoulder shrugs, and that would be, and oftentimes this is in conjunction with the head push or head shake. So somebody might do this. It's another way of gesticulating with the body in a rigid sense. Next we have fluent articulation. This one has to be measured through voice. So some signals in the code, the majority of them actually, are of vector movements of the body. Some of them are related to voice tone or the voice, but it is also objectively measurable. You can, for example, parse apart how frequent a person's articulation is or what the tone of the articulation is. In this case, if you are a JE lead type, or if you have strong JE signals, you also will have fluent articulation, which means you don't take rests very much between your words. It avalanches forward without intermissions. It doesn't have a lot of rests and stops, and aside from the ones that might be due to, like waiting for the other person to speak. But if the person is speaking themselves, then there's no problem going on and on and on and saying the next thing without really stuttering or clamping in between. So JE tends to be hyperverbal. So next we have projecting hands. Now this is when the arms extend outward from the body and they gesticulate outward with kind of a decisive clarity and a point to get across. So when you extend your hand forward and gesticulate, it's when there's conviction and agency to what you're saying. And people do it in proportion to how convicted they are about what they're saying. Now, projecting hands includes within it now pointed emphasis. So if somebody points and they do this, it's another version of doing this. We mesh these two together because they're not that different whether or not you're pointing or doing this, but it's the same sort of activity. You're looking at something and then you're just telling them what for, right? And this sort of commanding gesture is projecting hands. They can't just be here. They have to kind of leave your space somewhat and infringe upon the external world, which is what it means to connect with the object, as we discussed. So that's what that is. Okay, so with all these 5 put together in this collage here, you get a sense of what the JE signals will look like specifically. And now, after having shown somebody what these signals themselves look like in a literal sense, in a very vector-like sense, I also like to introduce people to a qualitative description to go along with it. And so we could describe these signals as strong, commanding, militant, authoritative, in charge, and king-like. They have a force about them, they have a confidence, and they have a control over their own body. But they also command the kind of control from other people. And that's why they're king-like. They kind of, oftentimes JE takes control of the room. When they walk in, they kind of command authority of the room with their regal stature, with their exacting hands, with their punctuation of the voice, punctuation of the hands, and all that. And that's what it means to have a king-like energy. Now, these are qualia signals, which means in themselves, they're not to be used to type people. You don't type somebody by whether or not you think they come across as strong. That's not the point. You type based on the 5 signals that we just went through. But the qualia helps ground your mind in what kind of message, what kind of broader phenomenon these 5 specific vectors are embedded within. So as we said, there's a ground truth, and then we use a measurement instrument to kind of dissect and pick out how to best categorize that ground truth, right? But we can't lose track of the ground truth either. So I've actually found that it leads to better results if we introduce people to not just the literal signals, but to the kind of the underlying energy in which they're trying to extract the signals from. Okay, so remember before I said that this Vultology corresponds to its own psychology. Well, this is what that psychology looks like. This is a written profile, which you could find at the link on the screen. But for the sake of summarizing, we can boil it down to these bullet points you see here. So in a sense, if you have this Vultology, which we just went over, there's a high probability that you will have executive abilities and organizational abilities, a focus on willpower, a thirst for personal challenge, leadership tendencies, and a comfort with being in command. So there's almost a one-to-one relationship between these 2 things here. And this is something that you'll see for yourself as we go through this lecture series. It'll become pretty self-evident by the end as we go through some celebrities and personalities, and we'll hear what they have to say and the lifestyles that they lead. But moving on here, we want to take a look at the opposite of JE, which is JI, or introverted judgment. So introverted judgment is a reactive signal set, which means that it tends towards non-action. So if extroversion is action, then introversion is non-action or withdraw of action. So you can imagine that it's hard to quantify something which is, by definition, an absence of motion. But it's actually possible. Because even the absence of motion or engagement in life leaves behind a trace by what it doesn't do. So when the body pauses, for example, or when it hesitates towards the object, that itself is measurable. You can see the hesitations and the pauses. And so in a way, there has to be at least a minimum amount of extroversion occurring for you to witness the pausing and receding and withdrawal to happen. And we can see this right away in the first signal here, which is called poised receding. So the description of this is that the limbs withdraw softly towards the torso with the elbows tucked in by the waist, protectively, almost like trying to defend the center of the body, while the hands fold privately. So rather than being out there like JE and just going at you, the opposite happens here, where the body tends to kind of cave in on itself. So the specific way the hands land is not that important. They could land like this, as we see in this image. They can land like this. They can land like this. Even doing this, it's a form of poised receding. So we don't want to get so specific that we try to isolate a specific way that the hands land, because that is missing the point. It's missing the forest for the trees. But we do want to kind of generally say that the hands retreat towards the torso area from wherever they are. And when they do, they delicately recede with a kind of sensitive frailty in a way. Now, another way that the body recedes from the environment is by the eyes becoming disengaged. So in this case, the eyes look downward while remaining facing forward. So if I'm sitting here looking at you and suddenly I do this, it means that I went into internal contemplation and I kind of disconnect from what was happening here in order to process. And the disconnect was so strong that I had to leave. My eyes just kind of ceased to care about the environment, because when you're introverting, the environment is not of your concern. You're not there. You're actually just kind of zoned out of the environment. So the eyes kind of respond that way by disengaging, literally by falling down. Now, notice here in these GIFs how they have that rigid posture still. So the image of the girl on the top, she's standing very stiffly, but is also kind of looking downward. This is a very characteristic JI posture. Okay, so here with the third one, it's exerted pushes, and this is where what I said earlier about introversion showing itself in relation to extroverted acts, that's when this starts to become very relevant, because exerted pushes is a signal that happens where the body struggles to gesticulate and has an exertion before the push. So in other words, the signal is itself the symptomatic effects which happen on a body that is struggling to come out, and then as soon as it comes out, it really quickly comes back in. So in a way, you could say exerted push is somewhat like a JE signal that is very weak and lacking confidence and lacking yang energy. So here you see Rooney Mara at the bottom. She's trying to gesticulate forward, but it's such a whisper of emotion. And here on the top, we see Bella. She's trying to push out, but then as soon as she pushes out, she very quickly just kind of retreats back in. So this is kind of a faint, exerted push. It's not very potent, it's not very strong, and it's very quick to dissipate. So it's an introverted signal, even though the act itself is a extroverted act, because what we're reading in the signal is actually the dissipation effect that we see on the energy. And the same logic applies to signal number 4 here, which is momentum halting. Now, this one is described as the body freezes abruptly midway through a motion as a result of introspection. So the body is going on and then it just kind of freezes in place for the duration of the introspection happening, and then maybe it picks back up when it, let's say, accesses the thought, or it's finished gathering that processing. So remember, we talked about how this is evidencing real-time processing of the mind. So, let's say if somebody asks me, what's your favorite food? And I go, I think it's caramel. That pause between my answer is the momentum halting, where I just kind of left the environment, processed, then came back out, right? That's momentum halting. And again, it's in reference to an extroverted context, but that's how you read it. And lastly, we have here meticulous hands. I really like this one. So the short description here is that the hands start to fold delicately with spindly fingers that articulate independently. So the fingers articulating independently is the kind of finesse and delicacy that has a correlation with JI psychology also, as you'll see in a bit. But and also, like the poised receding, there's multiple ways that the hands could land. So here you see examples. One of them here is this. You know, it may be like this. It may be like this, or like this. So if you see the fingers generally doing these odd spindly shapes in a kind of delicate way, that is meticulous hands. And the specific way in which they land is not that important as much as the act of doing something like this in the first place. So here you see a collage of all of the JIA signals happening together to get a kind of overall sense of what the qualia is. So for JI, the qualia signal set to help you anchor this together is delicate, meticulous, poised, passive, tentative, and prince-like or princess-like. So when people usually talk about somebody having a princess-like composure, it refers to this delicacy, this poise, this and which can be literally described by the retreating of the body, by the tendency to stay firm and rigid, to hold their ground but not assert their ground. The asserting the ground happens by the queen or the king, whereas the prince or the princess holds their ground in a poised way, but isn't the one doing the dirty work of actually moving the armies around or giving the orders. So mythologically, the prince or the princess act as a kind of beacon of right action, and this leads us into the behavioral characteristics of the JI type. So if you see anybody in your environment that displays the Vultology that we're just talking about here, the odds are high that they will have a focus on their own identity and truth, typically in the form of a trueness to self principle or in an authentic living principle. They'll tend to have a focus on idealisms, which it doesn't have to be political, but it can be, and it's often related to something, you know, misaligned that they would hope for perfection to manifest in, something of that sort. They also have a focus on nobility relative to whatever they define as their authentic living. So nobility is one of those words that can be ambiguous because it depends on who you ask, of course. But in this context, I'm talking about basically these people are very focused on being right in character, not by anybody else's objective metric, but by kind of their own subjective metrics. And then when it comes to their creative arts, creative works, they'll tend to be very, very picky, very perfectionistic, very meticulous in their craft as well. And that'll tend to make them kind of slower because of that perfection. So this profile, just as all the profiles that you'll see in these videos, are extracted directly from observations of the people who share that Vultology. What these profiles are kind of a written manifestation over the years of the people who had this Vultological signal set. So first of all, we saw that this signal set, you know, has internal consistency. So these signals themselves seem to cluster. They also cluster in opposition to other signals. But then when you study the psychology of anybody who fits this physical signal set, then you summarize all the people who have that into a profile, and that's what we see here. So in this way, Carl Jung was a starting point, but not the end point. So we can't just rely on Jung's canon as the only source of insight. We actually go directly to the source. Now that we know what these people look like, we can actually just do all the research we ever will want on them themselves and get first-hand experience into the phenomenon. So next we have extroverted perception, which is also a proactive signal, just like JE is. But unlike JE, this is spontaneous and disorganized. And the first PE signal we see here is a restless momentum. For PE, there's a kind of baseline restless energy that runs through the body to where even when they're trying to be in a stationary position, there's still a kind of wiggle back and forth that's always happening, and a kind of fidgeting back and forth that's always happening. In other words, there's like an undercurrent beneath them that is always energetically vibrating, and their body is constantly in that subtle movement pattern. The body's kind of eager and excited, almost like on the edge of movement and like ready to move at any moment. That's restless momentum, which is different from the third signal here, which is called body swaying. That's like a specific instance of a big body swing, but there's like these little micro swings that happen all the time with PE types. So the next signal is toggling eyes, which refers to the eyes darting around the environment. Usually it's kind of an up direction like this, but it can also be side to side. And that kind of causes the head to trail with the eyes in some way or another. So there's a kind of ocular focus, which we haven't really touched upon yet, but with the perception functions, both of them are steered by the direction of the eyes. So perception is, for humans, very visual process. So to be, for example, a PE primary type means that the perception process that you have is the most dominant in your psyche, which means that observation and taking in new data is the governing force of the psyche, which causes the eyes themselves to be the central focus of the rest of your body's movement. So everything contextualizes themselves around this exploratory nature. So you look with your eyes and in your head, and your whole body kind of follows after that. And that's what it means to lead with perception. It means that in PE and in PI. So in PE, it actually manifests as the eyes wandering around a lot and glancing at things, noticing things. But also when there's abstract exploration of things that are not in the environment, the eyes kind of explore that latent space within the head in a way that still scans it around, even though it's not a literal space, which causes the eyes to toggle. That's something that's more of a Model 2 concept that we'll touch upon later, but it applies here too. So the eyes are toggling in the environment, but even they're also toggling in the environment that is produced by our minds, in our mind's eye, looking around for things which aren't things that are there, but they're things in your mind. So there's exploration that happens environmentally, but there's also mental exploration that happens by PE as they're thinking. And that's what causes the toggles to happen. So next we have body swaying. Now this is an example, like I said, where the head and torso kind of swing strongly. So restless momentum is when the body is just kind of simmering on its own. But then body swaying is when one of those simmers ends up being like a huge swing off to the side or something. And next we have casual hands, which is described as the hands glide in a very loose circular vectors, often sideways. So the hands tend to lack the structure of JE. So in JE, we saw that the hands have a very deliberate, intentional projection that has a very strong halt, right? And that's part of the accentuation and closure and the finality and decisiveness of the J functions. None of that is present in PE. PE is very open-ended, very loose, and very dynamic. And so in that open-endedness and that looseness, the hands are also open-ended and loose. There's no reason to come down hard with your hand if you don't actually you're not mentally coming down hard on anything, because you're kind of ambiguous about things, because you're just perceiving, you're not judging, you're just observing and dynamically living things out. So the hands lack that structure, so they gesticulate kind of on the side here like this, usually in a semicircular fashion. So that's how you'll see this signal express itself. And now we have here alert perk-ups. So remember how I mentioned that perception is primarily an ocular process for humans. So the eyes here of PE types tend to be very alert. So there's these moments where they'll kind of perk up into a surprise expression, like something catches their fancy, and the eyes will light up. So that light up is a surprise expression, which happens a lot with PE types. And you'll see that here with the eyes kind of widening at the same time as the body kind of jumps up a little in that surprise expression. Now here you see them all put together, and you can see a lot of swinging around and swaying, and the hands are going everywhere. This is kind of the holistic expression of what PE looks like. And again, like the other two signal sets here, we also need a qualitative anchor or a nest from which to place these specific signals. And that qualitative language can be described as restless, spontaneous, playful, loose, jovial, and puer-like. Puer is an old Latin word for child, so childlike works just as well. So it's very childlike, playful, spontaneous, loose, jovial, and restless. Now when it comes to the PE types, they have a behavioral profile here as well. And in general, this Vultology tends to connect with people who have a thirst for novelty and newness, freshness even. They tend to have an aversion towards staleness or monotony or routine. They have a tendency to constantly pick and change their interests. and they're always searching for new information. So they're data miners. And they also have a very plastic, flexible mind, and they tend to be very dynamic in the way that they can adapt to situations. So they have a high adaptability capacity. And they'll also tend to have a sense of humor, which is an odd thing to list here because it's somewhat subjective, right? People will say a sense of humor is subjective, but I don't mean like they are funny. I'm saying that they have to like crack you up, because that is subjective. But what I'm saying is that they themselves tend to see the comedy in things, and they like to joke around. So they like to banter, they like to pull your leg, and so forth. Whether or not you find them funny specifically is not the point. It's more like they enjoy joking around and bantering and so forth. They tend to be very creative people. You'll see them doing things from music production to art production to video content creation, everything. They may be into writing, in which case they'll do a lot of writing. The point here more so is that they have a generative ability. So rather than being very limited and low volume, like with a JI, because they want perfection in everything, they tend to be more high volume and have a higher traffic rate of their own production, but they also themselves have a more high traffic mind. So there's a lot going in there, and so there's also a lot coming out from them. So the final energetic we have is introverted perception, or PI. So like introverted judgment, it's a reactive process, which means that it lends itself towards inaction. So both introverted processes have a way of showing their inaction. And with the JI, their inaction is rigid, like the halting motions, right? But with PI, their move towards inaction is not so much like a rapid halt. It's more of a gradual decline downhill, like slowly coming to a rest, or like a car to where you let off the accelerator and it kind of just slowly goes down to zero. And so this brings us to the first signal, which is viscous inertia. So viscous inertia has two properties to it. The first is, like I mentioned, that the slow, steady decline into inaction, but the other is actually that the viscosity aspect is that it's actually kind of hard to get them moving again. You know, just like if there was an enormous boulder that you wanted to get moving, it's hard to get it back into motion because it's going to take a lot of energy to get it to move again, which kind of impedes it from having excitable movement. So it tends not to just jump right into action. It tends to kind of swing slowly into action, but it also seems to slide down out of action in a kind of slow, steady pace. So the body energy is not very spunky and it's not very instantaneous. And that lack of instantaneousness and that sort of gradual decline in and out, that's viscous inertia. Now, signal number 2 is when we get to the eyes. Again, like I said, both P functions are perceptual, which means that the eyes play a key role. With PE, the focus tends to switch a lot. It tends to toggle around and dart. With PI, there's kind of a one track that they're on. So they kind of have a fixed gaze at whatever they're looking at. And that's because it's a type of introversion where as they are piercing forward with their eyes, almost gazing at something, they're actually zoned out, and in their mind, they are perceiving their internal landscape and relaying that into their consciousness. But there's no need to explore because what they're doing is recalling. So recollection for PI has the property that the eyes look outward as if they're looking at something, but they're actually looking internally. And that's what's called memory recall. So when they're talking to you, they'll tend to just kind of fixate in one spot and just talk as their eyes don't move much. And their eyes are not moving because that's happening internally. Now, having said that about how the eyes kind of zone out as they are gazing, they also will have a tendency to do diagonal eye drifts. So that would be, for example, they may be looking at you and then they'll look over here for a moment and then they'll come back to you. So this looking to the side, there's nothing there of importance to actually look at. So physically, there's nothing there that they're interested in. But the looking to the side, that actually is a moment in which they're engaging with you, right? But they want to do a heavy memory recall. So that the heavy memory recall will cause them to need to look into their consciousness for that information, but they'll look for it to the side. And that also indicates that they're accessing the PI function. Next, we have searching scowling. Now, if what I mentioned before about diagonal eye drifts is a kind of memory recall to the side as they kind of look inside of themselves for information, then searching scowling is a kind of overdrive where they're really trying to look for something. So they'll be scowling at something, but what they're scowling at is nothing that's of relevance there. And the scowling is not like an angry scowl. It's more of the kind of scowl that might happen when you're trying to perceive something with higher clarity, in the wild. I believe this is vestigial from when we used to, as a hunter-gatherer, we used to look for something with a lot of keen attention, and the squinting of the eyes and the scowling is a kind of a hyper-perceptual focus, which happens when they're doing memory recall. So they'll scowl as a symptom of searching, and it's usually kind of at the ground. So they might scowl at the ground and look, and that's when they're actually doing a heavy PI access. And lastly, we have a narrow head zoning. Now, this signal is about the degrees of freedom that the head of the PI type has, and it usually stays within a kind of a cone-shaped perimeter. Now, more specifically, we mentioned how there's the fixed gaze tendency, right? And from that fixed gaze, which is kind of the default, they may scowl to the side and come back, they may look at the ground, but their head movements usually stay within this restricted perimeter of motion. And that's because the PI process is mostly doing recall, which only takes staring forward. It doesn't take exploration. But the opposite, which is PE, does take exploration, which actually takes looking around in all sides, because you're noticing and you want to look up and down, which is what this second GIF here does. So the top is contrasted to the bottom. So the bottom GIF here is not actually the PI signal. It's the opposite to show the contrast. So what you see is the head here represented by a blue sphere. And in the first GIF, it stays within that zone, you see. So there's kind of a side motion, it stays within that zone. That's what it means to have a narrow head zoning. And then on the opposite one, you see the head kind of leaves the zone because the girl here, Gigi Hadid in this case, she's looking around to the sides, up and down. So if you see a P type, a P lead, which means that they're led by the direction of their eyes. But if you look, and one of them is kind of looking like this much everywhere, that's PE. If one of them is kind of slightly looking within a certain circumference, then that's PI. Now here you see what all these look like together in a collage. As you can see, the movements are a lot more subdued, they're a lot more temperate, and they're a lot more relaxed. They have like a heavier weight to them. And so, like the others, if we superimpose a qualitative language just to give us an anchoring for them, we could say that they are described by slowness, steadiness, a kind of lethargy, viscosity, inertia, and they are senex-like. Senex is the old Latin word for old man or old age more generally. So these people, whether they're young or not, by the way, no matter what age they are, they have a seriousness to their body, but also this kind of calmness and composure, which reflects a kind of seniority. So behaviorally, people displaying this Vultology will tend to have a mental focus on global narratives, or like the trends and cultural movements that are occupying a certain social sphere. Usually they accumulate a vast archives of information about these global trends and where they're flowing. And I don't just mean this abstractly, I actually mean it like in specific. So they'll tend to have a lot of information within them. And they'll tend to offer guidance and counsel from that place, like on how to be prepared for life, how not to get scammed, how to build a practical future for yourself. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of counseling where they sit there and they're good listeners and they listen to your feelings and they walk you through things. No, I'm talking about counsel as in like you sit in front of a council as a CEO and they advise you as advisors. That's the kind of counsel I'm talking about. People that know a lot because they're knowledgeable and that have a lot of practical advice for you, and people that you go to in order to not get duped, in order to do the wise thing, in order to avoid falling into pits, that sort of thing. And lastly, they'll have a predictive talent. Of course, nobody knows the future, but PI will tend to be able to sketch out a likely future because of all the accumulated information that they have, which gives you kind of a landscape, and it dramatically restricts the possible futures into likely futures. So all these things kind of make them more of a tortoise than a hare. The hare in this case would be PE, the tortoise would be PI metaphorically. So here they are, the four energetics and their resulting psychologies. These four physical descriptions, they will give rise to these behavioral patterns in a statistically significant way. And as we saw previously with the density distribution map, most people will be heaviest in one of these four, and rather than being balanced in all four dimensions. But we're not done yet, because we haven't asked the question, what about the other three? If I'm heaviest in, let's say, JE, what is the likely strength of my other three processes? And here's where we have a fascinating opportunity to test another Jungian concept, which is hierarchy. So to recap, according to Carl Jung, a person who is predominantly extroverted in judging, or JE, would be the weakest in introverted judgment. And you can see this here in the diagram where if you have extroverted judgment at the top, you would have introverted judgment at the bottom in terms of strength. And then the other two processes would be somewhere in the middle relative to these two, which act as the top and bottom. This is what Carl Jung theorized. And this is because Carl Jung believed wholeheartedly in psychological dualism. So he believed that every push in one direction created an equal and opposite push in the opposite direction. And therefore, to have one function of the mind predominating meant that its antithesis would be repressed. And Carl Jung used various different synonyms when referring to this duality. One duality is conscious versus unconscious. Other times he talks about superior and inferior, differentiated and undifferentiated, and individuated and repressed. These are just examples of the way that he would cluster these two opposites together. So if you have a superior PE process, then you have an inferior PI process, and so on for each of the other three. Fortunately, now that we've established a physical set of terms to describe the four energetic categories, this is actually a testable claim. We can actually check whether or not this hypothesis is true according to the terms we're using. Because, for example, if a person is highest in JE, or proactive rigidity, then they should also be lowest in JI, reactive rigidity, and so on for the other three. And we would figure that out by counting the signals that show up in each of the four categories, as you see here, and then seeing whether or not the person demonstrates this relationship that Carl Jung is describing. So for example, what you see here on screen is a possible breakdown of signals per the four quadrants. And let's say this is within a span of 2 minutes, and where you have 77 signals of JE, which is clearly the dominant process here. And then you see here, the lowest signal count is JI at 11, which is the opposite J function to JE, so the antithesis. And so a result like this, what you're seeing here, would be compatible with Jung's hypothesis, especially if it shows up not just once or twice, but through hundreds of times with hundreds of samples. But it also may not be the case. We could see a different ordering. A different function could be the lowest represented if you have JE at the top. So the only way to know this is to actually test. But before we test it, we should also ask what about the middle processes, right? What would we expect those to be? So remember earlier that I said that Jung was notoriously ambiguous about the energetic orientation of the two middle processes. It's a bit unclear in his text whether or not the auxiliary, which is the supportive to the dominant, is of the same energetic orientation as the dominant or the opposite. But that's actually fine, because since we're testing everything from scratch anyway, we can test both of these hypotheses while we're also testing Jung's hypothesis about the inferior function. So there's been a lot of Jungian theorists which have sided on either side of this debate. For me personally, I'm going to represent this debate as the two viewpoints, the viewpoint of Karl Mayr and the viewpoint of Harold Grant. Karl Mayr was actually an assistant to Carl Jung for a while, and he knew him personally. And Karl Mayr argues that the auxiliary function has the same energetic vector as the dominant process, while the third is energetically similar to the inferior process. And on the other hand, we have Harold Grant, which says that the auxiliary is energetically opposite to the primary. So for example, if the primary is JE, then the auxiliary would be PI. And you can see both of these options, both of these hierarchies right here on screen. And the same structure you see here for JE would also apply for the other three processes as well. So in order to test this, in short, what we want to do is we want to examine the internal relationship that shows up between these four clusters. So if you're strongest in one of these categories, what are you most likely to be second strongest in, or third strongest in, or fourth strongest in? And that would give us a sense of what that order really looks like from the data. And we actually tested this within the same study that you saw here, where we took these 583 samples and we measured those 20 signals we saw earlier, and we plotted them on a graph like this. So what you see here is a graph showing the strength of each signal from 0 to a maximum of 5, because there's only 5 signals. If a person shows 5 out of 5 signals in that category, then the bar would go all the way to the top. So now in this example on screen, we have JE as the strongest with a 5 out of 5 score. So this would be a JE lead type. But they also have 3 out of 5 PE signals, as you notice here. And so this is what we'd call a person's development, which is their ratio of strengths between the other 3 processes that are not the primary. And in this case, we see that this JE type has a fair development of their PE process. So now if a person displays a strong presence in 3 of the 5 signals, that function is considered developed or conscious. And 3 is the cutoff point because it signals the majority score. So out of 5, 3 is the majority score. So that's when it crosses the line into developed or conscious. So in this example, we have a JE lead type with a developed or conscious PE process. And this would translate into their psychology too. So we would expect them to be strongest in JE psychology, and then their second strongest psychological set would be PE. Another word we use for this is double extroverted, because both of the extroverted processes are developed and both of the introverted processes are not developed. But we'll get into that more later. So again, here we have a JE lead with a developed PE, but that takes too long to write. So we made it easier on ourselves by just giving these different developments a naming convention. If it crosses the threshold of consciousness, we gave the function a little vertical line. And if it doesn't, we give it a horizontal dash. So the way we'd write this out is JE line dash, but we usually say that as JE double extroverted. Now, if instead of strong PE signals, we actually saw that they had strong JI signals that crossed into conscious levels, then we would give them this code instead. So it'd be JE line dash line, or what's called JE polarized, because the polar function is the one that's developed. And if instead we saw that the PI process was more represented, we would give them this code, which is JE line dash, and so on. So in total, there's 8 possible developments, and they all look like this, what you see here. These are all for JE specifically, but again, the same would apply to all the other 3 functions. Now, you may notice that at the bottom of the graphs here, the functions were arranged from left to right according to the Grant order, not the Meyer order, when we don't yet know who's right. But that's fine, it doesn't matter. For our purposes here, I just had to use some naming convention to start with in order to carry out the experiment properly. But the results would tell us what's really happening, but we just need a way to carry out the experiment. So we collected all those samples and we measured each one's development level. And the results per development look something like this. Now, this is not a very intuitive diagram at a glance. So a better way to organize this data is to combine these 4 energetics and then divide them by 4 to get the mean of each development. And when you do that, this is what you see. So what you see here is a percentage breakdown of how likely we are to find any one of these 8 developments in the public sphere. So the most likely development we find is line dash, which means that there's only one function that crosses over to conscious levels. And that's about 35% of the samples. And on the other side of the graph here, you can see that the lowest represented development of all is the one that is line, or the one where all 4 functions cross that threshold of the signals to consciousness. So that's less than 1% of the samples, which means that most people don't unanimously display those 20 signals. That's very rare. Usually people display a strong tendency towards one of those 4 categories, and they display the least tendency to have all the 4 categories or all the 20 signals. So what this tells us is that, yes, as Carl Jung noted, one function normally takes dominance, and all four functions being in equal stasis is actually irregular. It's so irregular that you almost never see it. But what's actually more interesting to us about this diagram is these first 4 bars here that you see. So if you look down at the bottom of the graph here, you'll see that the descending order is line dash dash dash, then line dash dash, line dash, and then line dash dash line. And so these are all the functions that have either just 1 or 2 functions conscious. And the 3 that have 2 functions conscious are arranged in ascending order according to the Harold-Grant hierarchy. The other smaller 4 bars here to the right side, they're just compounds of the first 4. So the first 4 are what really matter to us in terms of determining hierarchy. And what we see is that, yes, of the 4 core function developments, the 4th function appears to be the most difficult to bring into consciousness across all 4 energetics. So the theorized 4th function actually is in 4th place according to this graph. Now, this is incredible to me because this could have been anything. This graph could have been anything. We might have seen that the 2nd function show up in 4th place, or any other combination could have occurred. But instead, what we see is essentially an ideal representation of Carl Jung's hypothesis, where of the 4 functions, if you have a lead one, then the least likely one is the one that's antithetical to the primary. So literally there appears to be an antagonistic relationship between these energetic processes, where if you have a certain visual expression and that corresponding psychology, you're less likely to have an opposite visual expression and psychology within the opposite J or P process. So going back to this diagram, not only do we see proof of the 4 energetic functions, but we also see proof of the polarity that exists between the dominant and the inferior process. In other words, the shadows here are also hierarchically organized according to Carl Jung's initial speculations, which was really another one of those moments that just blew my mind. There have been studies done trying to find something like the cognitive function hierarchy in the data collected from, let's say, the Myers-Briggs instrument, but with no success. So to my knowledge, there's no Jungian model out there that has provided any data-driven justification for the belief in Jungian function hierarchies. In most typologies, function hierarchy is just taken for granted without anything beyond just theory and math to support a preferred way of parsing order. And that's an important problem, because one of the things you'll notice in Model 1 is that for every concept, every Jungian concept or concept in general that is included, the goal is there has to be a data-driven instantiation for it. Nothing gets thrown into the theory without a good reason for being there, like a data-driven reason for being there, something that we can see why it's there and measure, and somebody else can do the work to measure and see that it's there, so that we know that this theory actually corresponds to reality, rather than just being speculations on top of speculation. So now we actually have a data-driven reason to include hierarchy as a theoretical concept that is grounded in something factual. Now I feel like we need to summarize here where we are so far, since we've talked about a lot of things. So not only are we finding that there are visible definitions of introversion and extroversion, of judgment and perception, which align to psychology, to Jungian psychology, but we also see that they form these 4 clusters, and these groups have a multimodality, a discrete multimodality, and that discreteness shows that, as Carl Jung said, most people only have one function developed, but even when it comes to the order of the other 3 functions in the psyche, that order also matches Carl Jung's hypothesis, even at that level. And this is when I just stop and I think to myself that there's no other way to see this other than as an actual instantiation or proof of Jung's original model, or at least what Carl Jung was peering at imperfectly in his day and age, and which we're now peering at again now. It's just too specific in its structure. It's too isomorphic to Jung's structure for it to be anything else. But At the same time, now that we have clarity to see the structure objectively for ourselves, we can clarify all the questions that could not be clarified before. So because we didn't have the artifact, so to speak, like in our hands, in front of us to study, then we couldn't answer those questions. But now that we have the artifact in front of us, we can re-examine it. Rather than relying on secondhand descriptions from Carl Jung of the phenomenon, we can take into our own hands the exploration of it. And so in doing so, one of the differences that we see from Jung's view is that we actually do come across people who, although not many, who do have development in the inferior function into consciousness. So Jung didn't believe that that was possible, but we do have evidence for people bringing any one of the three functions into consciousness. Like we can actually say for ourselves, like this does happen. But despite that fact, the statistical likelihood of that still matches Carl Jung's hypothesis. So if anything, like if I was having a conversation with Carl Jung about this, I would just say like the inferior function like almost never comes into consciousness along with the primary, but it's not like an absolute rule that it cannot, nor is it a rule for the other two. It's just that the likelihood of it completely matches Carl Jung, which means like, to me, that means that what Carl Jung was looking at was more of like the statistical spectrum probability. He was describing that in kind of in an absolutist way, when all he needed to do was more describe it statistically, which I think is where the truth is. Now, having said that, and speaking of clarification, so remember, Carl Jung left open the question of the auxiliary function. It's very ambiguous as to what its orientation is. And well, according to this study, the results follow the Harold-Grant model. But actually, to be more precise, when we account for some extroversion bias in the data collection, we see 3 of the 4 energetics match the Harold-Grant model, and 1 matches the Meyer model. But the average of the 4 aligns with the Harold-Grant model, just completely. And so, for the time being, Model 1 adopts the Harold-Grant interpretation of function hierarchy until a time that we see something else emerge from the data. So the Harold-Grant interpretation, what does it mean? Well, it means that, let's say, if you're led with JE, then your auxiliary would most likely be PI. And if you're led by JI, your auxiliary process would be PE. And if you lead with PE, your second strongest Vultology is most likely to be JI. And if you're led by PI, your second strongest Vultology will tend to be JE. So another way of saying this is that there seems to be a natural affinity between JI and PE and between JE and PI. And they make a kind of dynamic duo. And in the psyche of most people, these two will be the more conscious processes at the expense of the other two. So, and in Model 1, we call these categories revisor and conductor. Revisor functions being JI and PE, and conductor functions being JE and PI. Of course, all functions are in some way antagonistic towards each other, but what we can say is that these are the least hostile towards each other. So if you're leading with a JI, the least hostile function for you would be PE, and so forth for the others. And the tendency for development corresponds to that easiness. So the way that the Model 1 interprets the results of this ordering of functions is that the reason why a person is less likely to develop a lower function is because there is more energetic toll. So what is energetic toll? Energetic toll is the physical and psychological strain associated with accessing and using a lower function. So using any of the lower 3 functions creates a strain in the body, which you can measure voltologically, by the way. We'll get to that. And it creates a strain in the psyche to access that function, which means it's more psychologically taxing to reach into the polar function or the other 2 functions to a lesser extent. But it's not impossible. There's a level of agency you have to alter your personal situation and to develop your JE function. Now, even if you did develop the lower function to a degree, it can never overrun or overturn your dominant process. So again, with the identical twins, it seems like you're genetically given a type, and that places you within a constraint of what your order of functions is. but within that order, there's room for personal improvement. So, and that's where nurture and environment play a key role. For example, if a certain person was raised in an environment that calls for them to exercise their JE process more, to get things done, to be more executive, more articulate, then that might be something that prompts them to take that course of life, while never actually ceasing to be the dominant type that they are. But you could have identical twins with different developments, which is why in Model 1, we include a person's development in the type code, because there's also enough psychological differences between the two developments that it warrants kind of a distinct treatment. And we'll get more into why development happens and how it happens and how to initiate that process in a different video. But I think we'll stop here for now. And thank you all for watching. But also, there is a quiz you can take in the description below to test your abilities to identify the 4 energetics. So looking forward to your results on that. And that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.